This is the Definitely Uncertain podcast, brought to you by Goldrock Capital. Each week, we look at how high net worth families can improve their lives, decisions, and investments in a deeply uncertain world. We always aim to provide practical information, even if we can't offer specific investment advice. Welcome, everybody. This is the Definitely Uncertain podcast. My name is Darren Rockman, and I'm a partner at Goldrock Capital, the 21-year-old multifamily office servicing families with wealth in Israel and around the world. And it is my very great pleasure to welcome onto the podcast Professor Avi Weiss. Hi, Avi.
Hi, Darren.
Lovely to have you on.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. So one of the things that has been an issue in Israel for a couple of decades has been the question of house prices. It's been a focus both for public and the government. And I asked Avi to join us because Avi is the president of the Taub Center for Social Policy Studies in Israel. Avi's got a doctorate from the University of Chicago. He was previously chair of the economics department at Bar-Ilan University. He's still a senior faculty member there. And amongst the many, many roles that he has taken in Israel, he was member of the subcommittee on the cost of living and competition in the Israel's Trachtenberg Commission. And he was the chief economist of the Israel's antitrust authority. So Avi should know, I should say. Okay, past. So Avi should know a few things about cost of living and house prices in Israel. So I couldn't think of anybody better to have on the podcast to discuss this than Avi. So we've been hearing about this problem for years. How bad is the situation?
It depends on who you are, who you're asking, obviously. Prices are high. There's no question that prices are high. Part of the problem is that prices of your initial investment has to be high. Now, let me take you back a long way. Let me take you back about 25 years. Okay. If I were to, let's say, buy an apartment today versus buying an apartment 25 years ago, the same basic apartment, and I were to finance it completely through loans, 100% financing through loans, which is something you cannot do in Israel. But let's say I were able to do that, finance it through loans. But what's happened is that between then and now, interest rates have gone way down. And the result is that the payment I would be making today in real terms would not be that much different than I would have been making in 1995. So when you're asking me how bad are things, well, since you have to put down a heavy down payment, then that obviously weighs on you very, very heavily. But in many ways, from a real perspective, the changes in interest rate and the changes in salaries, of course, mean that it's not really that much more expensive today than it was in the past. But let me take you down that road, because what happened was you had a little bit more than a decade of housing prices in Israel in real terms falling, and then a little bit more than a decade of housing prices in Israel actually rising. And therefore, what we're seeing now, what we're experiencing, and particularly the young people, is they're experiencing almost 15 years of increasing housing prices. So therefore, it seems very, very extreme. But people tend to forget the 12 years or so of decreasing housing prices before that.
Okay, so you mentioned the problem of mortgages and getting finance. Let's talk about that. How does Israel compare in terms of what you can get financed here versus what you can get financed, say, in the United States?
Well, in the U.S., you actually can get 100% mortgages, but here in Israel, you really can't. There's a limitation on what percentage you can take. I don't remember what the number is today, not having done it in a while, but there is a limitation on what you can take. That means you have to come up with a fairly hefty down payment, which is difficult for many of the young people to do, which is where the major problem comes in, not as much in the monthly return of the loan, but more in the initial amount that they have to put down.
Okay, so that's been sort of the focus of the problem, which is to get into the ladder, the housing ladder, you've got to clear this very high initial hurdle of a major down payment. And when you look at Israeli house prices in general and what the trajectory there, has that been the same thing that we've seen in other OECD countries, or has it here we've seen it something different happen?
So let me, as long as you're asking that, let me go back to that same period. If I were to take that same 25-year period from 1995 or so until today, until a couple of years ago, the direction of the movements of prices was almost exactly the opposite. During that first period, when housing prices in Israel were falling, housing prices in the OECD were going up.
Okay.
In the second period, when housing prices here were going up, housing prices in the OECD were actually going down. And the reason was because they were very, very badly harmed by the crash in 2008, while Israel was not that badly harmed. So therefore, things actually moved in opposite direction. But in the past few years, actually, prices have been going up in all over. And therefore, it's not that different for the past few years.
Okay. And if you looked at that entire period in cumulatively, is Israel in a worse position than other OECD countries?
No, not particularly. If you were to take a look at Israel over time and compare it to those other countries, again, going back that far, Israel is not in a worse position, didn't go up by more than the other countries did.
Okay.
But again, if you take a look at that period since about 2007, 2008 and on, then definitely it's a much worse position.
Okay. So now let's talk about the forces that are driving the increases, because you're saying there's been 15 years now of prices going up. We see it in the newspapers. Politicians talk about it. Are these demand driven, or is there just a lack of supply, or is it coming in both directions?
Well, obviously, demand and supply have to be put together before you can come to any conclusion. But what's been happening is that demand has definitely been going up very, very significantly, and supply has not kept pace with it. The increase in the supply has been limited. The increase in the demand has been very large, both from young people. Israel has a growing population. It's very unusual compared to other OECD countries in that the population increases by 1.9% per year, and that's been going on since about 1980 or so. And the result of that is that if you have this large increase in demand just from those people, the amount of the number of apartments that have been created in that time, the increase in the supply has been very, very limited, and therefore that already will cause increase in prices. The other thing that's happened is because of the low interest rates, for a long time people have looked at the Israeli housing market as a good investment. And therefore, there's been a large increase in the investment demand, and that just increased it even more. So therefore, the large increase in prices is an equilibrium outcome. It's not an outcome that there's some bubble that people talk about. There's no housing bubble here. This is just the outcome of supply and demand.
Okay, so let's now look at the supply side of things. Why is it that there is no or the supply is not keeping up with the demand in a country with, as you say, a growing population?
So that comes from a couple of sources. One is that, first of all, the government, Karen Kayemet, tends to own pretty much, not pretty much all, but a huge percentage of the lands inside of Israel. Right. And the release of those lands has been slow, not nearly kept up with the pace that has been even announced. And it just hasn't really happened. That's one piece of it. Another piece of it has to do with municipalities. The way that municipalities receive their money, the way that they are compensated, is through taxes that they place on the residents. In other words, what we call arnona in Israel, property taxes, which also happens also for businesses. And there's also some compensation from the government. However, what happens is that apartments, housing for municipalities is a loss. Only about 50% of the costs of the municipality are covered by the amount that the citizens pay, which means that the municipalities do not want to increase housing. They gain a lot of money. They make most of their money from businesses that open up. And that they're very much interested in industrial areas. They love industrial areas, but they do not want additional citizens there. And therefore, you will often have a situation where a piece of land will open up and it's being put out, and you'll then have a fight between the land authority and between the municipality about how many units to create. So, for instance, I live near a base, what used to be an army base called Sirkin. Yeah. And it's a huge area. And when that was originally being discussed to be opened up and for the army base to move, what was discussed by the land authority was putting up 17,000 units. and the municipality came back and said, we're not willing to put up more than 7,000 units. They met in the middle. Okay, so they're currently planning about 12,000 units. That was clear that was going to happen, but it always turns into a fight. So that's another side of the situation. The other side of the situation, I guess the third side of the coin, I have very strange coins. That third side of the coin is regulation. We know that the amount of the number of steps that you have to go through before you can actually get on the land, before you can actually build the unit, before you can get all the different ishurim, all the different I've lost the word.
Permits.
Permits, all the different permits. Thank you. All the different permits that
it happens, Avi, when you live in Israel too long.
I didn't say I live here too long.
Good retort.
All the different permits that you need in order to be able to create the units that you want to create, it's just overbearing, and that needs to be simplified very, very significantly in order to be able to make things faster. So therefore, everything takes a long time, and everything is very, very, very burdensome, and that's another side of it.
So when you talk about those three elements, clearly the easiest one to solve would be to increase city tax. Because if you made Arnona more expensive, or if the federal government or the national government, I should say, subsidized the cities, then that burden would be cleared.
That's certainly one of the things that you could do that would help a lot. But if you're taking it from citizens are going to obviously object to suddenly doubling of their property tax that they're paying. Yep. That's not something that's going to go over very well. And what mayor is going to want to go down and say, yes, I'm the one who doubled your property taxes, and go get elected again. So,
but of course, it's not the mayors who determine the property tax. That's actually a national. There's a national cap on that, right?
Yeah, well, you know that, and I know that. That doesn't mean that my neighbors know that, and they may not feel that way when election time comes. It's not going to be a popular move, and of course, financing it through the central government has to be financed from somewhere. You're going to have to increase taxes in order to pay that money. But you could shift the way the property taxes are paid. Instead of getting so much from the businesses, you could be getting more from the citizens, or the compensation could be moved from what you get for businesses to what you get for citizens, and that could help do it. But some change is necessary in that structure in order to make it worthwhile.
Okay, so we're now, a year and a half moving into 2 years, towards 2 years of COVID. Who can believe that it's been that long? How has the pandemic and the lockdowns, how has that impacted house prices?
Well, obviously, one of the things that happened is that interest rates fell. Interest rates falling goes back in the direction of what we talked about before. That just leads to an increase in demand. And we know that the demand for mortgages has gone through the roof. And the reason is that people are saying, well, now I can afford to buy myself an apartment. Sure. And both for investment purposes and also for living purposes. And therefore, the demand has gone way up. The supply there's been a slowdown in the amount of building. Obviously, the beginning of COVID, it happened because everything closed down, including building. But there's been that slowdown. And therefore, it's very clear that what's happened is that the problem has become exacerbated. It's worse now than it was then.
And of course, people working more from home becomes something that you're willing to invest more in. You're spending more time there. Maybe you need an extra room. Maybe you need a larger house.
Right, but I like to think in the further future, not right now. But let's take a look at some of the other implications that can happen. For instance, we are now getting used to working from home. You and I are now having this conversation from far away. I don't even know what city you're in, but I'm in Petach Tikva, and you are wherever you are, probably Tel Aviv, I'm going to guess, or Herzliya, and that's not what would have happened a while ago. A year and a half ago, I would have come into your offices and we would have sat down and had this interview together, or we would have met someplace else and done that. And the ability to work from far can change the real estate market also. Because if people, let's say, we do see, for instance, some businesses saying, well, I don't need so much office space because my workers can not come in 2 days a week, or I can shift between them and I can spend less on office space. In some industries, not in all industries. and that could have an effect in terms of where people decide to live. So if I now, am working from home 4 days a week, I need to go in 1 day a week. Well, I may not want to necessarily live in Tel Aviv anymore, or even in the immediate surrounding area. I can live further away, and I can commute, once a week or whatever is necessary, especially if the public transportation system gets better. And then I can afford myself better housing. So I can get a better place if I move to the south or move to the north, and I will do much better that way. So that's starting to happen a little bit, but you can see that possibly becoming a bigger trend.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Now, the Israeli government are very aware of this problem, have been for a long time, and have tried various strategies in order to address the issue. One of the most recent ones and probably most famous ones is the Dwellers Price Program, the Mechir Lemishtaken program, it's called in Hebrew. Have these programs been well designed to address the three core issues that you talked about: land release, municipal taxes, and regulation?
No, it hasn't been addressed to those at all. That's not what its purpose has been. Its purpose has been to help specific populations, which is supposed to be the population who do not currently or are purchasing their first apartment. But basically what it does, okay, so let's think about that entire plan. So what we're doing is we're now taking a group and saying, we're going to give you money back. We're going to give you a discount if you purchase an apartment.
If you, for example, you served in the army, you're a first-time buyer, you're a young family.
Yep. Exactly. We're not going to ask the question of how much money you're earning before we do that. We're not going to ask about, are you actually going to be living there, or will you perhaps just buy it and end up using it as an investment and rent it out to somebody else? So there's been a lot of abuse of that. But basically what you're doing is you're basically increasing demand. In other words, you're exacerbating the problem. You're not making the problem better. You're not alleviating it. You're saying, okay, all these guys who wouldn't have bought an apartment until now, including people who have no intention of living there, but their parents now have a good way to be able to purchase a cheap apartment because they can get, whatever
subsidized asset,
price, and that's just increasing the demand. So what's it going to do to the prices of apartments? They're going to go up. So so those people will benefit from it. But the rest of the country will actually be harmed by it.
Right. And the previous program that was touted, which was the zero VAT program, also would have had the same impact.
That might have been even a little bit worse. But it actually, I could tell a very funny story, which actually got me really. I wasn't laughing at the time, but actually. There was a very high level meeting that took place in the finance ministry. Yair Lapid was then the finance minister, and in fact it was probably the best organized meeting I've actually ever been to. But it was set for 1 hour, and it took exactly 1 hour. We had in there people from all the top ministries. We had from the Bank of Israel. We had basically everybody from the Land Authority, and 4 different economics professors. I was one of them, and we were brought in to discuss the Mechir Lemishtaken, the one
the dweller's price,
dweller's price. So that's the one that we actually went into to discuss, or something similar to it. Not exactly that, but what can be done in general. And that's what was discussed. The idea of the zero VAT was never discussed at all in that meeting. However, the next day in the papers reported that these 4 professors said to do this 0% VAT, and none of us were very happy about getting cited, about getting quoted for that, when it actually didn't actually
misquoted. Right.
Completely misquoted. I called to complain, but that didn't get me anywhere.
Too late.
No, I don't think that was a better at all, because at least in this one you were trying to aim at a specific group. If you had hit the group right, if you had put on a way that only they could get, and only if they live there, and only if whatever, if they have low incomes, then you might say that there's some argument to do it. What we had originally argued to do, what all 4 economists, even though we came completely separate, had argued to do was something that was a little bit similar, but not exactly. We said, you've got to show the public, if you want prices to go down, you've got to show the public that housing starts going up immediately. And to do that, you've got to release land really freely, quickly. And not only that, one of the things that I had discussed with them, but the legal department, with the land authority, but the legal department actually said, we are not allowed to legally do. I said, just pass the law and get a permit to do it, is that you would say that any kablan, any builder that buys, they're actually getting the land for free, that takes a piece of land and has to commit to start building on the land within 2 years. And that if they don't, that piece of land returns to the government.
Right.
They said, well, we can't do that. We can't sell it to them and then tell them we're taking it back after 2 years. I said, why not? And never got a convincing answer. But had you been able to convince the public that housing starts are increasing a lot, so that the supply problem is going to be solved relatively quickly, and at the same time, take steps in order to lower the price right now, let's say something like Mechir Mishtaken, but to the groups that you actually want to help, that could actually have a positive effect. Because what would happen is, by the increase in supply, people would say, if I own these extra apartments that I'm not living in, I'm going to want to get rid of them because I think the prices are going to start going down.
So you reduce the pool of buyers and you actually increase the supply in the market.
So that was the basic type of idea, and that might have worked to some extent.
Right. Okay. We have a relatively new Israeli government led by Naftali Bennett and the aforementioned Yair Lapid. What is the new government doing, if anything, to address this issue?
I've got to say that I haven't yet seen anything significant that's going on. There's talk, but until you see some actual plans, I'm just not convinced until I see something happening and working. So okay. I really can't really address that much. We're waiting.
One of the things you mentioned before was the impact of low and falling interest rates on this market. We're now seeing for the first time signs of inflation filtering through globally, including here in Israel. There's a big argument about whether this is transitory inflation or really taking hold, and something we've discussed on previous podcasts. What would an inflationary or a higher inflationary trend do to the housing market, and those who have bought houses in the last couple of years at these elevated prices or at these higher prices, B?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, obviously interest rates would end up going up. When interest rates go up, mortgages will no longer be as attractive. That will harm the demand. And you could expect, it would be possible that some housing prices, or at least the rise, would stop, and housing prices could actually even fall. The other problem is that building costs have gone up significantly, and if building costs go up, of course, that will cut in the opposite direction. So it's hard to know which way this is going to wash out. For now, it seems like the near future seems very similar to the past. I don't expect prices to stop rising that quickly, but the increase in interest rates, of course, could have a large effect.
Okay, all right. And if you had your hands on the policy levers, if the housing minister and the finance minister came and said to me, Avi, we'll do whatever you say, what would the three things you would do be?
Do I get to do an evil laugh now or something?
There it was. There's the evil laugh, Avi.
Because I'm really not very good at that. So, okay. Well, obviously, the first thing is increase the supply. I mean, that is the most basic thing. The most basic issue is a balance between supply and demand. If you want this to be solved, if you want the issue to end, if you want the prices to stop going up, you're going to have to increase supply. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. Reducing bureaucracy is not important only here, of course. It's important for everything. And therefore, that would be my second one. I suppose my third one would be to try to solve the problem with municipalities. And the thing is, if you're going to be building, if you do change those incentives, so that municipalities do want to add more citizens, more residents, then you also the municipality also has to take into account that it has to build more infrastructures. That's going to include education infrastructures. It's going to include road infrastructures. There's going to be a lot that's going to be needed, but that's certainly something that will be very, very important in order to alleviate the pressures between the two parts of the two bodies and allowing the more units to come into existence. But really, supply has got to be the answer.
And on the regulation side, the government is making noises that they want to slow the increase in regulation and maybe even roll back some of the regulation. Do you see that as a positive step, both in this context and in the broader context?
Oh, it's not only positive. I think it's actually absolutely necessary. I think to take steps, Israel is ranked very, very lowly in the ease of doing business. And the reason we're ranked so lowly is because of the heavy regulations in order to start anything new in Israel. And I think that's absolutely, absolutely necessary, in particular in building, but not just in building, imports, whatever it is, starting a new business, whatever it is you want to do. Simplifying the regulation is critical. You shouldn't need to go to so many different people in order to be able to get the permits that you need in order to move things forward.
Okay.
There should be somebody central that will be able to give you all the answers.
Okay. Well, Professor Avi Weiss, I don't know if we got all the answers, but we certainly got a lot of them. So, so thank you very, very much for being on the Definitely Uncertain podcast. It was a real pleasure.
Absolute pleasure, Darren.
As always, it is. So thank you, everybody, for watching. And you can check us out on YouTube. You can subscribe to us on SoundCloud or Apple Podcasts or anywhere you get your podcasts. So look out for further episodes. And we wish everybody a happy Jewish New Year and all the best. Thanks, Avi, again.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.